The average American household lives paycheck to paycheck. You work hard, you save, and you trust that the money you put away will be there for your future. But what if that trust is misplaced? What if the financial foundation of your entire life, the very dollar in your pocket, is slowly being hollowed out by the same ancient forces that destroyed empires? Think for a moment. Your parents, perhaps your grandparents, experienced a dollar that was tethered to gold. Then, in 1971, that anchor was cut, turning the dollar into a fiat currency, backed by nothing but confidence in the government. Now look around. Trillions printed, debt ballooning, and prices rising faster than your wages. Doesn't it feel like something fundamental has changed, even as the coins and bills look the same? We're told this is growth, this is investment, this is stability. But history, from the streets of ancient Rome to the cafes of Weimar, Germany, tells a completely different and far more terrifying story. A story where governments play games with the currency, and it's always the ordinary people who pay the ultimate price. This isn't just about economic theory, it's about your savings, your future, and the very stability of the world's most powerful economy. And the historical precedent for collapse is far closer than you think. When people think about the fall of Rome, they imagine legions collapsing and barbarians at the gates. But the real rot, the silent killer, was already inside the treasury. Empires don't crumble just from outside attack, they rot from within, and the most corrosive force is always money. For centuries, the backbone of Rome's economy was the silver denarius. First minted around 211 BC, it was nearly pure silver, and it was trusted across the empire. It was the confidence in metal form. But running an empire is expensive. Paying legions, building infrastructure, and financing wars. By the 2nd century AD, tax revenues couldn't keep pace with military costs, so the emperors turned to an age-old trick: currency debasement. They didn't raise taxes, which was unpopular. Instead, they reduced the silver content in the denarius. Under Augustus, the coin was about 95% silver. By the reign of Caracalla, it was down to 50%. By the mid-3rd century, under Gallienus, the denarius contained less than 5% silver, becoming a cheap bronze disc coated with a silver wash. The people could see and feel the difference immediately. Inflation followed. Prices rose because the money was no longer anchored to real value. What once cost a single denarius suddenly cost dozens. This wasn't abstract theory. It destroyed the lives of ordinary Romans. Merchants stopped accepting the debased coins, preferring gold or simple barter. Local economies reverted to direct trade because the currency was no longer trusted. And in a vicious cycle, the more confidence eroded, the more emperors struck cheaper coins, hoping that sheer volume would replace lost value. The debasement of the denarius hollowed out Rome's economic core. The fall of Rome was a long unraveling, and currency collapse was one of its sharpest threads. Fast forward to the 20th century, and the echoes of Rome are deafening. The German hyperinflation in the 1920s provides the most chilling modern blueprint for how a reserve currency can fail and how quickly society can unravel when money becomes worthless. After World War I, Germany faced crushing reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. Just like Rome needing money for its legions, the Weimar government needed marks to cover its obligations. Their solution? Print them. They thought they could paper over debt just as Rome had once struck more coins. By 1923, hyperinflation was raging. The numbers are legendary, but the reality was pure terror. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark before the war cost over 200 billion marks by the fall of that year. People carted wages home in wheelbarrows, only to find the money worthless by the time they reached the market. Pensioners starved as their life savings evaporated. And who survived? Those with real assets, land, factories, foreign currency. Those who were deep in debt found it wiped out by the inflation. Sound familiar? The destruction of the German mark fueled the economic despair and political extremism that set the stage for Hitler's rise. This wasn't a sudden invasion. It was the total collapse of trust, driven by the abuse of the printing press. This pattern repeated itself in the 2000s in Zimbabwe, facing debt and falling production, where the government turned to the printing press with devastating results. By 2008, inflation had reached an annual rate of 89.7 sextillion%. Prices doubled every day. Zimbabwe, like Rome, eventually abandoned its own currency, forcing its citizens to trade in US dollars or South African rand. Once again, a government thought it could cheat reality, and once again, the people paid the price. Now bring that lens of historical collapse back to the United States and the global reserve currency. The United States hasn't experienced hyperinflation yet, but the same foundational mechanics of debasement that destroyed the denarius and the mark are undeniably at play. When Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, the dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, backed only by trust. Just as in Rome, the temptation to spend beyond means became irresistible. Over the following decades, debt ballooned, the money supply expanded, and inflation became a constant undercurrent. While we don't need wheelbarrows of cash yet, the purchasing power of the dollar has been steadily eroding. A dollar in 1971 could buy what takes more than $6 today. The trick is always the same. Governments disguise inflation as growth. They tell citizens that higher wages mean prosperity, even as costs rise faster. They present trillions in new debt as investment, even when it funds consumption. And they point to rising stock markets as proof of wealth, even when the majority own little stock. The Federal Reserve and global central banks are now willing to print trillions at the first sign of crisis, a scale that is global, unlike Rome's imperial crisis or Weimar's national one. This means the next financial unraveling won't be confined to a single country. It will ripple across the globe. And if history is any guide, the ones who suffer will not be the elites who hold assets, but the millions who rely on salaries, pensions and savings denominated in increasingly fragile currencies. Inflation is not an accident. It is policy, the silent tax that has broken empires for 2,000 years. The question is not if the music stops, but when and whether you are prepared for the day the reserve currency, the world's current denarius, finally loses the confidence of the global market. The lessons are clear. Real wealth is not found in paper or digits on a screen, but in assets that hold value when money does not. Land, skills, and productive businesses. Never assume stability is permanent. The fall of Rome reminds us that financial systems can collapse slowly, then suddenly, as trust evaporates. When money stops being real, society itself begins to unravel. The concept of a reserve currency is the final, fragile layer of the system. It's what gives the US dollar its unique power and, perhaps, its most severe weakness. For decades, the world has operated on the premise that oil, global trade, and international reserves are all priced and settled in dollars. This demand from the entire world is what allows the US to run massive deficits without its currency immediately collapsing. It allows the Fed to print and expand the money supply in a way that would instantly doom a lesser nation. It's the ultimate global trust signal, but that trust is a relationship, and like any relationship, it can be broken. The debasement of the dollar's purchasing power since 1971 is a violation of that trust, even if it's a slow, managed one. Other nations, seeing the debt balloon and the printing presses run, are making contingency plans. They're accumulating gold, striking bilateral trade deals in local currencies, and exploring alternatives to the global SWIFT system. These aren't just geopolitical skirmishes, they are quiet, systemic rejections of the reserve currency status. What happens when global confidence is finally exhausted? When the world decides there is simply too much debt, too much printing, and too little real value left in the dollar? The lessons from Rome and Weimar tell us the answer. The demand for the currency collapses, the domestic inflation spirals out of control, and the country is forced to find a new, stable anchor. Constantine the Great stabilized the Roman economy temporarily by introducing the gold solidus, a coin of consistent purity, around 312 AD. He was forced to abandon the debased denarius entirely, but by then the Western Empire was already fatally weakened. The new coin only helped the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire survive for centuries. For the US, the abandonment of reserve status would mean the floodgates open. The trillions of dollars held overseas would rush home, not as a sign of investment, but as a sign of flight. That influx of cash, no longer needed for global trade, would supercharge domestic inflation, turning the slow erosion of purchasing power into a rapid Weimar-style hyper-debasement. It would be the sudden, not slow, part of the collapse that the Romans understood. When money stops being real, contracts fail, trade breaks down, and governments lose legitimacy. The very stability you rely on for your business, your home, and your job is predicated on the world's continued belief in a system that is, by its design, inherently fragile and easily abused by power. The central message from history is one of responsibility and preparation. You cannot control what the Federal Reserve prints or what Congress spends, but you can control where you store your wealth. Elites in every historical crisis have protected themselves with real assets. In Rome, merchants turned to gold and barter. In Weimar, those with land and factories emerged stronger. History didn't stop teaching after Rome. Every major inflationary crisis since then has repeated the same pattern. Governments debase money to cover their costs, elites protect themselves, and ordinary people are left broke. Understand that inflation is the silent tax. Realize that real wealth is in assets that hold value when money does not. The Roman currency crisis is simply the earliest full-scale example, a blueprint for collapse. The day the reserve currency dies won't be announced with a parade. It will be felt in the grocery store and the gas pump, a sudden, brutal final payment for decades of playing games with money. If you ignore this lesson, the weight of history will crush you all the same.